President Wilson, at this point, would you like to take over and put a bow on everything?
Yeah, Chris, great facilitated session. Folks, full team here. Frankly, we weren't really sure, how this is going to work out these last couple of sessions. This last one in particular, as our great moderator, General Howard said, we're trying something completely different here. And, General Clark has charged us with something, frankly, as I've come on board as the new president, joined this phenomenal team here at SOS University, the Joint Special Operations University. It's always great when your boss charges you with something that you wanted to do anyway, and we're frankly planning on doing anyway. And that was and is nothing less than taking a great organization of JSOU to even greater heights, and making JSOU as SOS University, SOCOM's and Special Operations Forces experimentation and innovation laboratory on all things relating to SOF education, leader preparation, and development. And so, these sessions, particularly the ones we've done today, that are bringing in participant engagement, that's what a PME, a professional military education laboratory, a learning laboratory does in terms of experimentation, adaptation, and the ultimate imperative, I believe, innovation. And sometimes it doesn't work out. I think we got more lucky than not this time in it working out. But the preparation, the confidence to try different things, try things beyond the box, and not just outside the box, but beyond the box, and to fail fast. If you're going to fail fast, and so you can pick up and learn from those mistakes and move forward. Your participation, not just in the forums themselves, but in the spaces in between, as we'll be reaching out to you, and hopefully you will be inspired to reach out to us to be a part of this running net estimate, part reflection back and retrospective of who we've been, and where we are currently, and most importantly, so that can inform in an anticipatory way where and how we need to head forward, not for ourselves as any particular instrument of national power or an element of force, but only us as instruments being ways and means towards that grander purposing end, which is for nation or nationhoods, I might say, of the greater collective self here that we're talking about in terms of the U.S., the Western community of nation states, and our allies and partners that we team with for grappling with the monsters out there that find their way to us in terms of challenges, but also being greater and more confident in the risk taking and the advantaging of risk to take advantage of those opportunities that lie across the threshold crossing. As Chris Marsh said, Dr. Marsh said, I've got the duties and the opportunity, frankly, to close this out, try to put a bow on this 3 days of what have been some phenomenal scholarship with practical impact, consultative forum discussions and dialogues. And I know also I'm at we're at the end of a hard week and a hard set of intellectual overmatching thinking. And so I don't want to take up too much of our time, but I do have some prepared comments that I'd like to try to put on the table just to kind of tie things together and leave us with some takeaways. So just a little bit more patience, I would ask, and then we can move forward. And again, I've only got 3 slides that are going to be pictures worth the 10,000 words that you certainly don't want to hear from me on a Friday afternoon. But just to start, and then we'll just riff off of this pictorial here for a second. I'm going to call this, looking at SOF forward at the threshold crossing. And if, you get the notion, those of you who are fans or familiar with the Star Wars series and the power of myth and all that building off of the great works of the greater Dr. Joseph Campbell and the hero of 1,000 faces, this idea of the hero's journey, in the threshold crossing, right? Our nation and frankly, the world, you don't have to look beyond COVID to get a good picture and a feeling of what we're talking about here. Our nation and the world that follows us is clearly at a threshold crossing. And what comes with that is an identity crisis. And so a lot of people, a lot of great people, greater than me, have been doing some phenomenal thinking and research in a provocative way of putting on the table that special operations forces and the soft enterprise writ large is suffering right now an identity crisis coming out of 20 years of a clarity that built over time of what SOF had to do and had to become exquisite at doing in terms of the context of what at the time we called the global war on terror or against terror, the GWAT, a particular context. And now at another threshold crossing of what that means as we must look forward in maybe at a more broader context of great power competition in the 21st century. Again, as I said, I think day one and day two, great power competition didn't go anywhere. It's always been there. And in fact, if we took the great piece off of it, we might have a better appreciation of really what we might be talking about here. We might be talking about power itself. We might be talking about power in the contrast to force, just as force is a essential element of the power equation, right? Newton told us this a couple of hundred years ago, I believe, at least 180. That force is not power. It's a poor proxy for power. But maybe really what we're talking about first and foremost, fundamentally, is power in transition and how that relates to a more specific context of the so-called great powers, with the United States of America being the great of the great, what that means in that context. But really, fundamentally, what we're talking about is force and power. I think our identity crisis, both is soft and for the nation that we serve, that's where identity crisis lies. I think that's fundamental level where we need to start to unpack it so we can start to address this new identity. I put on the table in the opening video back on Wednesday, seems a couple of weeks ago, right? I put on the table then that, at this threshold crossing, if you consider this a fourth age of SOF, organizationally so, looking at the modern organization of special operations really, earmarked organizationally back around the time of World War II. Since then, we've had 3 ages, if you will, of SOF from an organizational standpoint. If you look at special operations and special operators, I mean, of course, this goes back much longer time horizon. As the slide shows on the screen, at least to 1915, going all the way back to our colonial and frontier period, and even particularly when you expand the notion of what constitutes a SOF professional, a SOF operator, and begin to appreciate, including the likes of, Morgan's Raiders, Harriet Tubman, right? We don't tend to think about these iconic figures in that sense, but she was a spy, she was an operator, as well as running the Underground Railroad, right? And so many examples in between. You can take these ages all the way back to upwards of 8 to 10 just in the period of time of the American colonial period. And I'm just talking about U.S. SOF, right? When we expand this to the broader frame of our allies and partners, it's an incredibly broad history and heritage. And of course, with the great OSS being their centerpiece, 75 years anniversary this year, OSS being shuttered, and so glad the conversations at the 75-year anniversary of its closure, that there are great conversations with practical intent to maybe consider bringing back some kind of 21st century construction of OSS. We really talked around the margins of this over the last 3 days. But before I get too far off my main points that I want to leave you all with here, just by this slide alone, we can start to see and appreciate this notion I put on the table back on Wednesday and hit again yesterday, that GPC never went away. We were drawn in a particular context away from the great power competition part of this continuum, and now we must return to what was always there, more forefront to our mind, and more importantly to our instrumentality as SOF. And just from 1915 today, and we're looking at a century plus of SOF and GPC. So what does that mean? And let me just riff a little bit on a couple of things I think this means just from this slide alone. First and foremost, history again is illustrative, as this slide illustrates. All past returns of great power competition, or rather our returns to it, have found a renewed and amplified incidence of so-called small wars and irregular warfare, and what we came to know during the strategic period of the Cold War as low intensity conflict. In fact, we have our service-like organization, our policy partner from a Special Operations Command standpoint, ASD, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low Intensity Conflict. It's not ASD-SO, it's not ASD Special Operations, it's ASD Special Operations and Low Intensity Conflict. The two are imperative, and I think I would put on the table, just to provoke thought, that part of this identity crisis is getting back to that fuller expansion, because that really starts to get us in the right frame, as I would propose, of understanding the utility of special operations in context of purpose, which is low intensity, cooperation, competition, and conflict. So not only SOLIC, but SOLIC to the third exponent, right? That might be something worth fleshing out as part of our running study on the utility of SOF in GPC. The second point I'd like to make and emphasize here is from a long cycles of war, peace, and state development perspective, the modulation and moderating of international relations and force and power exchanges between episodes of systems changing conflict and wars, or what we might call great wars, and those great concerts of peace that eventually follow from those big wars, that moderation between those spaces in between, has largely played out through the utility of force in limited wars and low intensity conflicts, and through the utility of special operations more pointedly. If we go to the next slide, we've got a little diagram that shows that explicitly. And if you're looking at the slide, it'll be on your right-hand side, the SOF and GPC piece of this. Third, therefore, special operations have always lived and proved their utility and relevancy in these quote unquote spaces in between, right? In these so-called gray zones, below the classic thresholds of war, of real war, and intendedly so. Sometimes I think we lose the bubble and forget that the win is left of those booms. The win is left of those booms. We certainly have to be prepared to be exquisitely, and as I said on Wednesday, undeniably, unbeatably aggressive in the violent sense of the term, if and when we get pulled across or must cross ourselves on our own volition, that threshold into real war. But short of that, special operations has always been about getting the win in that way that provides us a win without having to fight, achieves the nation's purposes and intent short of war, while at the same time being able to be unbeatable if and when war comes, right? That's SOF's utility as a modality of political warfare, as the great Dave Maxwell would put it, right? Consequently, fourth, these special operations other than or short of war have always been about applications of force, from the lethal to the non-lethal, the direct to the indirect action, at the nexes of all things, but pointedly, the nexus of the human security and the national security, local, state, national, regional, transnational, trans-regional, global, the nexes between states, non-states, and also let's not forget alternatively or differently ordered statehoods different than the nation state, although the nation state still the primary actor of the current international system. Again, today this is all occurring amid the compounding and otherwise separate and discrete challenges and opportunities that increasingly tend to converge at certain historically recorded geographic nexus or strategic pivot places and spaces. And our activities need to be aimed at the root causal level of underlying currents and primordial constants of grievances and resource scarcities. We talked a lot about this week, and I think we need to delve deeper and put more meat on those bones. Let me start to summarize with a couple of more points. First and foremost, the relevant impact of SOF's utility in GPC is, and this is a hypothesis that we're going to test now, and it's a provocation intentionally so. I think the relevant impact of SOF's utility in great power competition is therefore nothing less than anticipating, finding, and creating ways and opportunities that allow us to do two things simultaneously. First, bend the escalation curve downwards, lowering the amplitude of contestations of force and power. And secondly, extend the spaces in between lost moments of relative peace in the next great power war, right? I'm going to end with a couple of thoughts on imperatives for SOF's profession and the professional ethic. And I want to bring this back to SOF truth number, the first SOF truth. Not forgetting the human element here. There's a great book out there that all military officers know, and if they don't know, they should get to know it. And we really need to expand the knowledge of these books. The first one was published back in 1951 by the great George C. Marshall. Actually, George C. Marshall commissioned SLA Marshall to write this book, and it's called The Armed Forces Officer. And though I'm talking about the Armed Forces Officer, I would say the tenets of it apply well beyond military officership and more into the broader SOF professional, and even more broadly, the civilian national security and defense professional at its most broad parameters. What that book's updated every periodically, ever so often, about every 10 years or so. And I think the latest edition came out around the 2013 timeframe. One things I want to point out here is, regardless of what context of the times were about, that this book encapsulated and always gave updates to what was defined as a core set of 4 tenets, defining American professionalism and the role of the professional, and American officership more pointedly. And those 4 are being the action leader or the warrior leader in a profession of security and defense service or a profession of arms. That's number 1. Second, being a member of a profession itself. Thirdly, and most importantly in my view, being a servant of nation. And then fourth, being a leader of character in the conduct of the former 3. Regardless of the times, regardless of periods of great war or small wars or no wars in between, those 4 tenets are fundamental. And at the core of those 4 tenets is what Marshall talked about, both Marshalls talked about, essential to the character of professionalism and officership, and that is this idea of fidelity, right? What's fidelity? It's commonly referred to as faithfulness to something to which one is bound by pledge or duty. Again, in spite of all the formal rules or in legal statutes obligating the professionals' connection to the American people, fidelity has proven to be the most enduring tie that binds professionalism and officership to the nation. This bond has helped the nation weather many storms, both foreign and domestic. The fidelity of the professional has always found its strongest roots in the rich soils of American history. And let me just end off of that by saying that particularly the SOF, Special Operations Personnel we're charged to address unique, specialized, and difficult military problems that require exceptionally trained, exquisitely equipped, and tremendously supported warrior diplomats, war fighters, and education lies at the key of this. Today and tomorrow's compound security dilemmas demand a restriking of that critical balance of fidelity with the general will we serve between SOF's exquisitely specialized warfighting and the nation's core values, and a 4th age SOF professional ethic. And this imperative to always keep SOF sharp at the edge and to ensure the utility of SOF always remains exquisite, proactive, and aimed at solving problems, and always in ways that avoid moral injury to the nations that we serve. This, and nothing less than this, is the governing purpose of these quarterly running JSOU forums and the purpose of SOF in general, and this community of thought and practice that we are building here through these forums. So I just want to thank you all for the resiliency and for sticking with this through the week. I want to encourage you all to help us finish strong with the completion of the surveys that we're giving you. These are not our grandparents and our parents' surveys coming out of a traditional conference. These surveys we will use directly and deliberately to shape the next context and forms of the running forum. So please do take the time over the weekend, maybe over your favorite cocktail, and fill out that those surveys as best as you can. The other thing I will say before turning it back over to General Howard to truly finish us here is to let you know that everything's been recorded, as we've been saying, and we are going to be putting the recordings through what we call serial review. That takes typically a few weeks. We are going to work on shortening that time horizon so that we can keep these conversations at the forefront and on the leading edge of practice. So more to follow on that, and that'll be coming to everyone for their consideration soon. Thank you again very much, and more to follow, and we'll see you guys next quarter for the next JSOU SOCOM forum. Thank you very much.
This ends our first, really our second, but our first forum for Great Power Competition. I would like to reinforce Dr. Wilson's request that you fill out the comments, and our announcer is going to tell you how to do that in a minute. I hope all of you learned as much as I did these past 3 days, and I know none of you had as much fun as I had these past 3 days. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the spring.